The studio of The View had seen its fair share of memorable moments over the decades' lively debates, celebrity revelations, political showdowns, and even occasional walk-offs, but on this particular morning, the air seemed to vibrate with something heavier, sharper, and more electric than anything the crew could quite articulate. Long before the cameras began rolling, the energy in the ABC building was different. Makeup artists spoke in lower voices, stage managers moved with a heightened sense of precision, and even the security team, usually calm and professional, exchanged knowing glances as though they were preparing for more than just routine crowd management. It wasn't just the names on the guest list that had everyone on edge. Angelina Jolie and Meghan Markle, two women whose public images carried extraordinary weight in the global consciousness. But the unspoken understanding that this was not going to be another polite promotional segment. The audience, packed with ticket holders who had waited months for this taping, felt it too. From the moment they were ushered into their seats, their murmurs had a different timbre, more akin to the excited hum of a stadium crowd before a championship match than the usual chatter before a daytime talk show. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, every faint crackle from the microphones seemed amplified in that quiet before the storm. At center stage, the couch gleamed under the lights, positioned like an arena floor waiting for its combatants. Whoopi Goldberg, seasoned moderator and cultural icon, took her seat with the weight of a general about to referee two opposing armies, while Joy Behar's smirk was already betraying her anticipation for sparks. Sarah N. flipped through her notes, though her eyes flicked constantly toward the wings as if bracing herself for a collision. Alyssa Farah Griffin leaned back, scanning the studio with a politician's awareness of optics, and Sunny Hostin tapped her pen against the table, silently calculating how best to steer an inevitably fraught conversation without letting it spiral into irreparable chaos. The anticipation reached its first crescendo when Whoopi's familiar baritone introduced Angelina Jolie. If the room had been buzzing before, it now erupted into a roar of applause that was almost reverential. Angelina's arrival was not the typical celebrity entrance. It felt ceremonial, as though someone larger than life had walked into the studio carrying decades of credibility, tragedy, and grace. She moved with the fluidity of someone who had walked red carpets but also trudged through refugee camps, her black tailored dress understated yet impossibly elegant, her posture neither stiff nor theatrical but grounded in quiet assurance. When she waved to the audience, it wasn't the wide-armed politician's wave or the self-conscious flutter of a celebrity caught off guard, but something warmer, closer to a nod of recognition. "I see you. Thank you for being here." Even the panelists, hardened veterans of interviewing countless stars, straightened in their seats as she crossed the stage and lowered herself onto the couch. Her presence altered the room's gravity. The audience, though still clapping, instinctively quieted, as though they didn't want to miss even the smallest gesture. In that instant, Angelina seemed less like a guest and more like a figure stepping into her own element, radiating calm in a space designed for conflict. The applause had barely died down when Whoopi announced the second guest, Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex. The difference in reception was not subtle. The audience did clap loudly, enthusiastically, but there was an undertone, a polite obligation, rather than the spontaneous eruption Angelina had inspired. Meghan emerged from the wings with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her outfit immaculate in the way that suggested hours of calculation rather than effortless taste. Every detail, from the jewel-toned dress to the perfectly sculpted waves of her hair, was curated for impact. She waved, too, though her wave was broader, almost presidential, a sweeping acknowledgement that demanded notice rather than invited it. And while Angelina had seemed to ground the stage, Meghan seemed to sharpen it, turning the space into a theater where she was both actress and director. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that might have been lost on some, but to those watching closely, it was a sound of assertion. "I belong here. I will be heard." Yet beneath that confidence, in the flash of her eyes as she glanced toward the audience before taking her seat, there was a flicker of something hungrier, sharper, as though she wasn't just there to promote her Netflix project but to wage a broader battle for validation. From the moment both women sat side by side, the contrast was breathtaking in its clarity. Angelina's body language spoke of presence, of being in the room, attentive yet relaxed. Her shoulders angled naturally toward the panelists, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her smile unforced. Meghan, by comparison, looked as though she were perpetually aware of the cameras, her back rigid, her chin tilted just so, her hands clasped in the deliberate placement of someone trained in media optics. To the casual viewer at home, these differences might have seemed minor, but to the live audience, to anyone with even a passing sensitivity to authenticity, they painted an unmistakable picture. It was the collision of two archetypes, one of service and substance, the other of branding and performance. And though neither had spoken more than a few words, yet the atmosphere of the studio had already shifted. The panelists, sensing it, exchanged quick glances. Sarah raised her eyebrows at Joy. Sunny scribbled a note with unusual urgency. Alyssa leaned forward, as if already strategizing how to moderate the ideological battlefield that was quietly forming before their eyes. For the viewers at home, the camera operators instinctively framed the shot to capture the two women together, a deliberate juxtaposition. The image alone told a story. Angelina, relaxed yet commanding, versus Meghan, polished yet tense. Twitter would later erupt with screen grabs of that opening tableau, captions dissecting everything from the angle of Meghan's jaw to the softness of Angelina's smile. But inside the studio, before a single provocative word had been exchanged, the people present already sensed that they were witnessing something extraordinary. It wasn't just two celebrities appearing on a talk show. It was two philosophies of public life colliding head-on, one rooted in humility and service, the other in grievance and self-mythology. And as Whoopi leaned into the microphone to begin the introductions, her voice carrying that tone of practiced authority, there was a collective tightening in the room. The curtain had risen, the players were in place, and the stage was set for what would soon become one of the most unforgettable half-hours in television history. From the very instant the pleasantries were exchanged and the conversation began to take form, the chasm between Angelina Jolie and Meghan Markle became unmistakably evident. Not in overt hostility or open clash, but in the subtle gestures, the tones, the glances that said more than scripted words ever could. Angelina leaned slightly forward as she spoke, her eyes locking with whoever she was addressing, creating an intimate connection that pulled both panelists and audience into her orbit. It was the same gaze she had once directed at world leaders, when advocating for displaced families in Geneva, or at children in makeshift classrooms in Jordanian refugee camps. Steady, grounded, and wholly present. She didn't perform her sincerity, she embodied it. Every nod she gave while listening to a question, every pause before responding, carried the weight of someone who had not only thought about these issues in abstract terms, but had lived them, borne witness to them, and carried their stories in her bones. Her words, when they came, were measured, not rehearsed, but considered. She began by speaking about service, about how the privilege of her platform demanded responsibility, and how every public appearance, every headline, was an opportunity to redirect attention toward those who did not have a voice. It wasn't grandstanding, it was almost matter of fact. Yet the audience responded with bursts of applause that came not because she sought them, but because truth has a resonance that no amount of media training can counterfeit. Meghan, seated just inches away, responded to these same questions with an entirely different energy. Her smile was bright, her voice smooth and modulated, every syllable enunciated with the crispness of someone who had trained for interviews, rehearsed possible questions, and mapped out her answers in advance. Where Angelina's sentences carried the rhythm of lived conviction, Meghan's often carried the cadence of a press release, carefully structured, polished, but hollow at the edges. When asked about her latest projects, she pivoted seamlessly into narratives of struggle, of having been silenced, of finding her voice against all odds. On paper, her words were compelling, even admirable. But in the room, her delivery revealed its fragility. The audience clapped, yes, but there was hesitation in the applause, of politeness rather than passion, acknowledgement rather than admiration. Her posture betrayed her. While she smiled, her shoulders remained stiff, her hands gripping her lap in a way that betrayed tension. And when Angelina spoke, Meghan's expression, though carefully mass-tightened at the edges, her jaw clenching slightly, her eyes flicking toward the cameras as if to reassert her control over the narrative. It was not lost on the panelists either. Joy Behar, whose comedic instincts were attuned to the smallest human absurdities, leaned back with a knowing smirk each time Meghan shifted the conversation toward herself. Sunny Hostin, ever the prosecutor in spirit, jotted notes furiously, as though cataloging inconsistencies for later cross-examination. Sarah N., typically the empathetic heart of the panel, tried to bridge the gap with gentle follow-up questions, but even she seemed caught off guard by the stark contrast in authenticity unfolding in real time. And Whoopi, the anchor of the table, studied the exchange with a mixture of patience and restrained disbelief, her years of experience telling her that she was not moderating an interview, so much as watching two worlds colliding before her very eyes. Angel, to her credit, did not seem interested in competition. Her tone never rose, her words never sharpened into personal attacks. Instead, she continued to expand on themes of humility and responsibility, weaving in anecdotes from her humanitarian missions, not as self-aggrandizing tales, but as windows into broader realities. She spoke about walking through refugee camps where children clutched dolls made of scraps, about conversations with mothers who had fled war zones only to find themselves trapped in the purgatory of state. Her descriptions were vivid, but never exploitative. She spoke of these people not as backdrops to her story, but as individuals whose dignity demanded recognition. When she spoke of listening more than talking, of amplifying the voices of others rather than overshadowing them, the audience leaned in. You could almost feel the air shift, the kind of hush that descends when people realize they are in the presence of something undeniably real. Meghan, perhaps sensing that her own narrative was losing ground, leaned harder into her personal brand of victimhood and resilience. She spoke of her time within the royal family, framing herself as a figure silenced by tradition and crushed by institutional indifference. To some, these stories resonated. There were sympathetic nods in the crowd, but to many others, the repetition rang rehearsed, the grievances recycled from past interviews and op-ed. The tension became most palpable when she attempted to draw parallels between her experience and that of marginalized women globally. When I was silenced, she began, her voice heavy with practiced emotion, I understood, in some small way, what it means for women everywhere to have their voices taken away. On paper, it was a powerful line, but seated next to Angelina, who had literally sat with survivors of war crimes, with girls denied education by violent regimes, the comparison hung in the air like an awkward note, off-key. There were polite claps, but also a ripple of shifting bodies in the audience, the kind of physical discomfort that happens when something doesn't quite land as intended. The most telling moments, however, were not in what was said but in what was unsaid. Each time Meghan redirected the spotlight onto herself, Angelina's eyes softened, not in pity but in patience, as though she understood the deep insecurity that drove such insistence on being centered. She did not interrupt, she did not correct, she simply allowed the words to pass, and when it was her turn to speak again, she gently but firmly redirected the conversation back to broader issues: refugees, statelessness, education, human rights. The contrast became, in itself, the story. Where Meghan sought validation, Angelina sought solutions. Where Meghan's sentences ended with herself, Angelina's ended with others. The audience picked up on it instinctively, and social media would later amplify it to a fever pitch. But in that studio, in that moment, the divide was already clear as day. By the time the segment reached its midpoint, the panelists were no longer simply asking questions, they were navigating an emotional minefield. Whoopi, sensing the imbalance, tried to steer Meghan into safer territory, asking about her new ventures. But Meghan doubled down on her familiar refrains, returning again and again to themes of personal pain and betrayal. Joy, half amused, half exasperated, threw in a quip that earned a laugh from the audience but a tight smile from Meghan. Angelina, meanwhile, responded to even the light-hearted questions with grace, her answers sprinkled with humility and a kind of understated wisdom that made even jokes feel like moments of reflection. That was here, in this quiet yet undeniable divergence, that the real power of the episode revealed itself. This was not merely an interview, nor was it a staged debate. It was a live demonstration of two different ways of inhabiting public life, one rooted in the cultivation of self, the other in the surrender of self for something greater. And though the clash had not yet reached its peak, though the gloves had not yet come off, the audience already knew which voice rang truer. You could see it in their faces, hear it in the uneven rhythms of their applause. One woman was performing, the other was present. One was chasing validation, the other was offering vision. And in that tension, in that contrast, the stage was being set for the inevitable collision still to come. The tension, which had thus far lingered like a low drumbeat beneath the conversation, began to rise in sharp, unmistakable notes the moment Meghan leaned forward, her voice dipping into that deliberate cadence she often employed when positioning herself as both survivor and truth-teller. She clasped her hands in her lap, her wedding ring catching the studio lights. As she began, when you've lived a life where institutions actively silence you, where every attempt to speak is reframed as manipulation or selfishness, you come to understand how fragile your sense of self can become. I wasn't just a woman silenced by a system, I was a voice taken away. She paused there, letting the words hang, her gaze sweeping across the audience before darting toward the cameras. The studio clapped, but it was uneven, half-hearted in places, strong in others, the rhythm betraying the divided reception. Meghan pressed on, and I think every woman, everywhere, whether she's in a palace or in her own home, knows what that feels like: being diminished, being told you're too much or not enough, being dismissed for daring to exist loudly. Her voice softened at the end, a practiced quiver curling the syllables into something resembling vulnerability. For a moment, she sat back, clearly expecting the applause to swell larger, stronger. But it didn't. The audience clapped politely, but the energy remained fractured. Angelina, who had been listening without shifting her gaze, leaned slightly forward. She didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice. She simply entered the silence Meghan had left behind with a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the dramatics of her neighbor. I understand what you're saying, she began, her tone almost maternal. And of course, every woman experiences being underestimated, silenced, or dismissed. But I think the question we all have to ask ourselves is, what do we do with that pain? How do we turn that into something that lifts others rather than simply reminding the world of our own wounds? Her voice carried no accusation, yet the words landed with surgical precision. For me, she continued, when I've seen women silenced, it wasn't in palaces. It was in places where they couldn't go to school because of a militant regime. It was in courtrooms where their testimony was dismissed simply because they were female. It was in refugee camps where girls had no documents, no identity. and no way to claim protection because they weren't even recognized as citizens. The studio fell into a hush so thick you could almost hear the sound of pens pausing mid-scribble. When I sit with those women, when I listen to their stories, I don't bring my own pain into the conversation. I bring my ears, my pen, my willingness to amplify them. Because at the end of the day, my job isn't to center myself, it's to make sure they're seen, even when the world would rather ignore them. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The audience erupted into applause, this time without hesitation. It wasn't the obligatory clapping of politeness, but the kind of applause that comes from relief from hearing a truth articulated that had been silently felt but not voiced. Meghan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the cameras to catch it. Her hands, still clasped tightly, squeezed harder as though she were bracing herself against the force of Angelina's words. The panelists, too, reacted in real time. Joy shot Sarah a wide-eyed glance that screamed, "Did you hear that?" Sunny leaned back in her chair, a slow smile creeping across her face, while Whoopi muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Well, there it is." Sensing the narrative slipping from her grasp, Meghan countered quickly. "But Angelina," she said, her voice now tinged with urgency, "with all due respect, silencing is silencing. Whether it happens in a palace, in a home, or in a refugee camp, it's still the same wound. It's still the same feeling of not being allowed to exist as yourself." She looked to the audience, her expression pleading for alignment, for recognition. Pain is relative. You can't tell a woman that her pain is less valid just because someone else's pain looks different. I think it's dangerous to start ranking suffering.